Thank you very much, Cressida, and thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's really great to talk to an audience. This is the first time since 1.5 years I've been talking to a camera or computer screen, so this is really nice, and it's also nice to have some persons online. Now, as Mary Cannon just said, I've been working on this issue for quite a number of years, so and several of the previous presenters have said parts of what I'm going to say. So it's interesting that we pick up different pieces of a large amount of data and evidence, and we present things in slightly different ways and with different figures and with some really beautiful graphs by Dr. Madras. And I'm sorry I do not have those figures, but I have other figures. So I hope you will be able to digest this and that you do not get confused, that we give basically the same message, but in various ways. Now, cannabis psychosis is strongly controversial, a very much discussed issue, as we have already heard. And it's a difficult research area. I don't think that has really appeared in the last presentations, but schizophrenia has a low incidence. It's a common disease in the sense that there's a high prevalence in the population because it's a chronic condition. But if you want to assess the rate, the incidence of schizophrenia and differences in incidence by exposure, you need long follow-up studies and you need large populations. So that is one reason why it's a difficult area. And there has been new evidence, some of which you have already presented, some of the previous speakers. And of course, the legalization wave has increased the interest in the risk of psychosis. And this quote was already made by Mary Cannon. A huge pharmacological experiment is currently underway with the brains of young Americans. And this is an old Swedish headline from a tabloid, but I think it's very interesting that the concept of hash psychosis or cannabis psychosis is very widespread, and that is a rather minor disorders that can affect anyone, and this girl looks very happy all the same. Now, if she had schizophrenia, I don't think they would have had that type of tabloid. It's like people say COVID, well, that's just a minor flu. So I think that this illustrates, again, the misconception you have on the effects of, that is common in society, of the effects of cannabis. Now, what I will present is basically a story of increasing evidence of this association between cannabis and schizophrenia and other psychosis. And if you go back in times, the earliest, as I have gathered, systematic evidence, the Hemp Commission was mentioned by Dr. Madras, but before that, there was this French group of intellectuals who tried cannabis, and they tried it on each other, and there was a physician who sort of documented very, very carefully the experiences, and he wrote that there is not a single elementary manifestation of mental disorder that cannot be found in the mental changes caused by hashish, from simple manic excitement to frenzied delirium, from the feeblest impulse to the most irresistible drive, the wildest delirium, the most varied disorders of feeling. So I think that that's a rather interesting first systematic observation of the very different types of effects of cannabis use. Now that was, of course, cross-sectional, and that is a short-term effect. So I think that just like we heard from Dr. Emmett just before the break, it's good to separate acute and chronic effects. And can talk about how long time, days, months, weeks, years, and what we talk about regarding the association with schizophrenia psychosis, that's really years, so that is long-term effects. And the acute effects, I would say, are well known since long, and they are rather easy to measure. You do cross-sectional studies, you look at patients attending emergency room or whatever. And there is where you have this idea of the so-called cannabis psychosis, which is a very sort of undefined concept, but that is what you can observe easily in the acute stage. Now, as I have already mentioned, it's more difficult to assess long-term effects, but and we have mentioned already various types of known effects, the so-called Motivational Syndrome. That is also slightly controversial, but again, it was mentioned this morning that it's a state of sort of passivity, of you lose your interest in food and sex and all pleasures of life. Some people say that that's just an effect of chronic intoxication, but it is something that you observe. We have heard about anxiety syndromes and depression, but what is the clearer, the strongest association, and also the most specific one, I think that most research now show that psychosis is really the effect that is most sort of specifically related to long-term cannabis use. And there are many types of association between cannabis and psychosis. Cannabis causes psychosis, and I will come back to the concept of cause that was also mentioned this morning. It can trigger latent psychosis, it can cause a remission of earlier psychosis. Psychosis can cause cannabis abuse. I mean, if persons with psychosis, they tend not to so much care about their lifestyles, about the friends they interact with. They can fall into cannabis use, so that is definitely a possible pathway. And it can be a confounding factor, something else, genetic factors or whatever that cause both cannabis use and psychosis. Now, what we are interested in now is what cannabis causes psychosis. And it is interesting to what extent this word causation or cause has been perceived as problematic when we talk about cannabis and mental effects, while it doesn't feel problematic when we talk about other conditions. So I am from the sort of epidemiological research background, and there cause is a factor, an exposure that increases the incidence of disorder. So you can say that smoking causes cancer. I don't think anyone would argue against that, although not everyone that smokes even gets lung cancer. You can get lung cancer without smoking, and many people smoke without getting lung cancer. And there are many other sort of common statements. Sedentary life causes obesity, and even COVID, I would say. You can live with a partner who has the disease, and you may not get the disease yourself. You even can have the virus, SARS-CoV-2, in your body without having the disease, COVID-19. But no one would argue saying that SARS-CoV-2 does not cause COVID. So, but when we talk about cannabis and psychosis, even the authors themselves, probably reflected by what reviewers have been pointing out, they are very careful in making all kinds of reservation about perhaps not, or we never know, or it may be residual confounding. Whereas they don't say that when you talk about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, for example, or smoking or cancer. So I wanted to expand on this because it is, I mean, if you want, you can say that on the individual level, you can say that it may cause, or population level, you can talk about increased incidence, but I think that we should not be afraid of saying that cannabis causes psychosis, and I will give you some evidence of this. Now, as I said, we need longitudinal studies, and as Barry Cannon said, at that time, in the 80s, when I started to get interested in this, there were no study where a really large group of persons were identified as with cannabis exposure and with the ability to follow up through individual sort of identification. So I got the idea that in all Swedish conscript studies at that time, in conscription service, all men at that time were called for conscription, and they had to fill in a questionnaire. They were asked, or they also had various types of questions that were interviewed by psychologists. But there were data on, I will come back to the data we had at baseline, but we were able to follow them then in patient registers, in medical journals for subpopulations, and cause of death register. And we have also, as mentioned earlier, done some other studies also on cognitive function. But so the first study, Sven Andreasson, my colleague and PhD student at that time, he did the first follow-up study, and again, the questionnaire that all conscripts had to complete was on smoking, alcohol, use of drugs, and they asked which drugs and how many times. Then how many times have you used cannabis? That was the sort of level of exposure. What we found at that time was this nice dose-response curve. The higher, the more times they had reported. So this was the sort of measure used of level of consumption. And they were 18, 19, around 18, most of them at the time. So what this reflected was their exposure during their late teens. And as we have heard, again, about causation, you need a few criteria. I don't present all of them, but to have a nice dose-response relation, that is a good criteria for causation. Also that we have the temporal association. We did actually also look at some medical records of these cases of schizophrenia to find out, did they have signs of mental illness before schizophrenia, but that was not the case. And we are actually still now looking at medical records. So what was interesting and good with this conscription data was that there was an interview by psychologists. They were asked about other factors, the family background, friends, school performance, etc. So when we controlled for these factors, there was still a nice dose-response association with about threefold increased risk for schizophrenia among those with the highest exposure to cannabis. Now, then we got into contact with British colleagues who were very interested in this, so they helped us with sort of refining the study. And we followed them up a longer time. So by that time, they were around 45 years. We had 362 cases of schizophrenia. We excluded cases of schizophrenia the first year after conscription in order to further exclude these reversed causation. And we had learned more about these possible confounding factors. And as you see, the results were very much the same, but a little more precise, since we had more cases at that time. But still, threefold increased risk among those with the highest level. So what was interesting is that this was published together, and I think together with a paper just mentioned by Mary Cannon in 2002. And you see, this was the headline, the first page of the rather famous British Medical Journal, and it says that the link grows stronger. So this was in 2002, where several articles were published on the same topic. And a few years later, a review was published, and this, I think, was a turning point, and I will explain why. Because at that time you had 7 prospective studies, ours and a number of others, but the sort of bottom line of all this was that the double risk for psychosis among high consumers of cannabis, and then some other more specific, if you looked at all kinds of psychotic disorders, 2.6. And this article said that there are still methodological issues that can be discussed, but we conclude there is now sufficient evidence to warn young people that using cannabis could increase the risk of developing psychotic illness later in life. Now, again, what psychotic disorders was this? Now, the rather common terminology was the schizophrenia spectrum disorders, because again, the specific diagnosis of schizophrenia demands many subjects that most of these cohort studies did not have. And the other is that you have to be very specific on the diagnostic criteria. But our study, we really sort of identified, we did special validity studies, and that the cases we find were schizophrenia. But in most other studies, it was what they call schizophrenia spectrum disorder, which is as serious as in the pictures we saw earlier, but not sort of sufficient to definitely call it schizophrenia. So that is why I mentioned schizophrenia and other chronic psychosis in the title of this paper. Now, the most interesting with this paper was that it was accompanied by an editorial in the Lancet, which is often considered as the major medical journal in the world. Perhaps besides we have Americans here in the audience, the New England Journal of Medicine may be even higher standard, but Lancet is the European, probably highest standard. So it said that in 1995 we began a Lancet editorial with the since much quoted words of smoke of cannabis, even long term, is not harmful to health. Research published since 1995, including more systematic review in this issue, leads us now to conclude that cannabis use could increase the risk of psychotic illness. So I think that is very interesting that the world's most famous medical changed his opinion. So now this, I think, was what you can call a paradigm shift regarding the view of the association between cannabis and psychosis. Now, we did another study later on. Our latest sort of major follow-up study was in 2012. And the interesting finding here was that in those, they are now up to over 50 years. For those of you who are psychiatrists or interested, you see that there were new cases. These are new cases of schizophrenia even above 50. Usually say that schizophrenia is the incidence, peak incidence is 18 to 30 years, but we have new cases above 50. And here, among those with the highest exposure, they still have an increased incidence of schizophrenia. Ever use, those who reported having used sometimes, they had an increased risk here, but here diminishing, but not increased risk here. Now, what we are trying to find out by some further studies on medical records is this because they continue to use until adulthood? Or was it because this high exposure at a young age really created disturbances in the brain that continues lifelong? I'm inclined to believe in the latter hypothesis because of what we have heard of the brain development at a young age. So a heavy exposure in young age can be a cause of lifelong increased risk. There was another systematic review a few years later, and now we are up to, I think, 10 different studies, some of which we have heard about today, and ours is in the middle here. But again, this shows very clearly that basically all these longitudinal studies have found a nice dose-response effect, which, as we have heard earlier today, that is a good sign of causal effect. But of course, the level varies somewhat, and ours is in the middle, which is plausible, since ours is the biggest one with around 50,000 subjects, and if you have really big big number, big population, you tend to in the middle. So other studies with perhaps lower power have found more varying results. Does it sound okay? Okay, better. Okay, there were some issues that were still debated. One about the age, and there has been various studies. I just showed this one by D40 that I think has already been mentioned. They compared users before 15 years, users after 15 years. There was a much higher risk among those who started the cannabis use before 15 years. Frequency of use, we have heard this nice dose-response association. But here, again, the potency was shown to be important. I think this was among the first studies who really could show that the potency of cannabis does have an important effect on the risk of psychosis. And what also, this was a question I have presented our findings over many years, and a very common question is, but how about these societies, countries, regions with a very high, for example, countries like Morocco, do they have a higher schizophrenia incidence? Well, for Morocco, I think it's very difficult to know because it's difficult to, the assessment, the criteria, the case finding of schizophrenia varies very much between countries and sites. But so this was the first study that showed that if you do careful comparison between different sites where you do measure cannabis use well and where you measure incidence of schizophrenia in standardized ways, you can find out to what extent does a higher occurrence of cannabis use in society, is that also reflected in a higher incidence of psychosis? And I think we have seen this picture. There were some cities, Amsterdam, London, particularly, and Barcelona, I think, who had a higher use of prevalence of daily cannabis use and also a higher potency of cannabis in that setting. And that was linked to a higher incidence of psychosis, which is a sort of indication that the population effect and not only on the individuals. And also, I think that the last or the most recent finding on this subject is of particular interest also, and this is interesting since we are now in Copenhagen, where you have very good disease registers and good epidemiologists. So in Denmark, in Denmark, the incidence of schizophrenia has increased. Can cannabis use have a role in this? And they could look at the so-called population attributable risk. That is the proportion of cases of schizophrenia that can be attributed to cannabis use. And and they looked carefully at these registers. Had these cases of schizophrenia been treated for cannabis use earlier, according to the registers? And they could look at, they found out that indeed the population attributable risk had increased over the years, which is consistent and follows nicely with the increase in cannabis exposure. So I think that now we can conclude that there is a strong evidence for a causal association, and I hope you now have arguments when you educate for this using the word cause correctly, that there is a causal association between cannabis and chronic psychosis, including schizophrenia. There's a high risk if you start at early age. There's a high risk with a higher potency, as we have already heard. And there is now also an effect on population level. So I think that was all. I do not need to go into detail here, but I think that these conclusions summarize what we have found over the years with the repeated follow-up of our conscripts and what we have heard from other studies also earlier today. So thank you and good luck in your further work on this important issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, again for being here and sharing your insights on the relation between cannabis and schizophrenia even more, in more depth and detail. And yeah, you have fairly proven that, or highlighted that the increase of potency end use of cannabis has proven to be having an increase of psychosis or schizophrenia cases with shocking numbers. And also the whole misconception, as we have been basically talking about the whole day, of the effects of cannabis, that it's not so harmful, and that actually there are very acute effects on it. And I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. Otherwise, I do have a question. Have these results you have been presenting here before with us, and you have been having these findings you have been having throughout the years, been taken into account in further discussions around legalization of cannabis in your observations?
I think that, I don't know if we will hear more about the different sort of countries in Scandinavia and the policy aspects. I would say that in Sweden, the policy and the thinking about cannabis is still more restrictive than in some other countries, and of course in particularly compared to the United States. I mean, to what extent our results have been influential, I cannot say anything about that, but I think that there is an awareness, and I think that also among psychiatrists, I mentioned that only briefly, the fact that cannabis use is a problem for persons with schizophrenia. I mean, the other way around, the other causal direction is also important. So I think that Swedish psychiatrists are very aware of the fact that patients with mental disorders and psychosis, they should avoid cannabis. So I think it's good also to have that community aware of the harmful effects. But I think that we have a problem because we have a minority in Sweden who are also very much in this sort of legal ideological framework. But I still think that the policy in Sweden still is, we have other Swedes who could respond. And what is interesting, just since you ask this, effects of our studies. What is interesting with our studies is that we have 50,000 persons, including in this study, who all conscripted for military service in 19. And also, when I talk, perhaps we even have today 1 or 2 Swedes. Did you belong to this cohort? Yes. So that is what we heard earlier: public participation in research. So when they have so many people have been involved in this research, that is perhaps also an additional advantage.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Another question from the audience, the online audience, is how is this knowledge used in psychiatric care for these patients?
No, as I said, yeah. I think that I have responded. But I've also met many psychiatrists who help with advocacy. They do. The reason, I could have mentioned this, but the reason I got interested in the 80s, because I worked in psychiatry, and there were patients with cannabis use. There were persons who developed, they came in with so-called cannabis psychosis. And then I worked also in drug treatment units where people came in with psychosis, and they said that you are psychotic, you cannot be treated here. When they came to psychiatry, you can say that, but you have a drug problem, you should be treated at the drug unit. So this is what arose my interest. So I think that psychiatrists are aware of this problem.
That's good. Oh, I'll bring the microphone. Yeah.
Oh. Okay. There is a saying that in some debates that in areas where the use of cannabis has increased, then the rate of schizophrenia has remained stable. What is your comment to that?
Well, my comment is that there are various findings. There are some studies that have not been able to detect this difference, as you said, but there are also countries. There is one study from London. They have looked at different parts of London, where there is a difference in cannabis use and also difference in incidence of schizophrenia. There is one similar study from Switzerland. So, but again, you really have to standardize how you define the cases of schizophrenia. So that is one major difficulty. And I think that these last papers or studies I cited are very convincing in that they have used very standardized methods.
Thank you very much. It was a really interesting talk, Peter. I think you've made me a little bit more confident in being able to say that cannabis causes psychosis. But as you know, people will continue to challenge that. And I suppose that just a question for you in terms of your broader knowledge about public health and epidemiology. Can you think of any example in the history of epidemiology where there has been this much evidence about an environmental risk factor linked to having a causal impact on a disease that turned out to actually be false or inaccurate? Again,
yes, I can. I mean, but sorry, the way you put your question, a risk factor that turned out to be false, or well, my immediate reaction was there is a protective factor that was proved to be disastrous when they did more sort of good longitudinal studies, and that's the use of hormone replacement therapy. That not only would be good for the women, I mean, the well-being, but also could predict for some cancer, but it turned out to be deleterious for the other types of cancer. No, I think it's much more common with sort of so-called harmful exposures, such as smoking, that turned out to be difficult. But I will think throughout the coming day about your type of association. I mean, associations found to be harmful that later does not turn out to be harmful. I think there are such examples. I think that history is full of sort of revisions of finding.
Thank you for an excellent talk. I think that one of the comments you made about the reluctance of people to attribute psychosis and ultimately schizophrenia to marijuana is a unique phenomenon in terms of medicine in general. And I'm wondering if you have any subjective feelings as to why there is this deep reluctance compared to almost any other forms of causality versus association debates?
Well, I think that in general, I think that schizophrenia is something that is so difficult. I mean, your illustrations were really excellent, but they were also frightening. So schizophrenia, somehow, I think that again, it's a rather common disease, and many of us have friends and relatives with some person with schizophrenia, chronic psychosis in the family, and we all know how very hard that is, lifestyle, life of parents and relatives, so we don't want to think about it. So it's much nicer to show this young girl who was a TV star during a few years, and she got a cannabis psychosis. That's just like a flu. But just the thinking, it's a step, it's a threshold to think about schizophrenia. So you just sort of wipe that thought out of your mind. That is a very simple reflection.
Do you think another factor is the heavy-handed political pressure on the scientific community not to make this correlation?
I think that here we have really a transatlantic divide, because European researchers do not have that I mean, it's really a minority in Europe, I would say, who are these strong pro-legalist advocates. I think that, I mean, they are strong, but a small group. But in US and Canada, there's quite another political pressure. So we do not have the political pressure, but we have pressure from groups. I have got mails and letters also, but not at all like colleagues in in the Western world.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you again, Peter.
Okay, and thank you for
all your questions.
very interesting interaction and good questions that I will think about.
Thank you.